Mukta, so many people in the world, including myself, are rather puzzled by one fact. Why did India, which imposed, rather strict nationwide lockdown in March 2020, when coronavirus just hit India, but why the government avoided that this time? Not only avoided national lockdown, but also let the election to go ahead in West Bengal. Election events like election is conceptualized as a mobility event in our inventory, which is very curious to me, at least. Why in modern society, which is supposed to be rational, but this type of mobility event, like festivals, rallies, and elections, actually appear to be even more important than before, to the extent that the government or parties cannot afford to cancel or postpone. But anyway, so my main question is that why did the government not impose lockdown, and what lessons were learned from last period experiment with the lockdown, this immobilizing population, and did that trigger any unintended mobilities which were counterproductive? And what the situation is like this time, when they replace large-scale lockdown with local containment. Is that work better in your view? Again, this is a question how we can control a pandemic through regulation of mobilities, which is a very tricky business. So we do need lots and lots of evidence to see what is the best way to regulate the mobilities with, without creating unintended consequences. Yeah. What's your view about lockdowns?
Yeah, thanks, Biao. I think we need to understand that there were like two regulatory frameworks that were operating together. So there is an Epidemics Act, and which is an old 100-year-old, more than 100-year-old law, which is where the terminology of containment comes from. So this is a standard public health practice. You try to isolate an infectious disease by creating a cordon around it, and which is called a containment. And this is a pre-existing and often used practice, for time immemorial. And since it's basically colonial law that continued after independence. But the last year's lockdown, the additional layer to it was framing it under the National Disaster Management Act. So it was seen as a national disaster to really, I think, create the idea that this was an unprecedented event that the world was experiencing, and there was a very law and order approach to then implementing the lockdown. So everybody in the country is following the same rules as you. You are not an exception, so stay home. So sort of that was the messaging that was being given last year. Of course, I guess premised on the fact that many countries were doing things like this. But there were very heavy costs to that lockdown, as we know, because of the large numbers of workers in India who are dependent on mobility for livelihood, and not just mobilities across sort of from rural to urban, but also mobilities within the city for livelihoods, and a lot of workers in India who work in the informal sector and therefore have very fragile sort of savings and requirements. So there was a lot of pushback. But there was that large reverse migration that happened as a result of this extremely centralized way of implementing the lockdown. So I think there's a fear of, or there is a policy hesitancy to go back to that kind of a measure because of the enormous criticism and the cost that the country had to pay, because they had to actually ramp up the social safety net a lot in order to support all these large number of workers who lost their jobs and livelihoods for months on end. The other imperative, of course, has been this idea of a graded return to economic recovery once the first lockdown. So the lockdown was not just ended, it was phased out. And and if you can look at the documents, it's unlock one, unlock two, unlock three. So it was a very sort of, there was a certain language to how the lockdown was phased out. And it's very clear that the government really understood the need to bring the livelihood and the economic recovery narrative, alongside, and understand the trade-offs between mobility restrictions and economic recovery. So when this economic recovery, when the case slowed came down, economic recovery became the new focus of policy. And now, as is well documented through many media interviews and commentaries, there was also a point where there was, severe pandemic fatigue in terms of the way people were behaving on a day-to-day basis, but also pandemic fatigue among policymakers and politicians, because they were eager to go back to, the political economy that India is used to, which runs on a cycle of this kind of patronage and elections and this political cycle, and these are very important events in the public life of India. And so there were multiple state elections, not just West Bengal, multiple state elections. Uttar Pradesh just concluded local level elections, rural panchayat elections also, which have relations also to triggering mobilities of migrant workers who are living in cities but would like to go back home and vote, because being relevant politically in places of their origin is an important priority for many migrant workers. So it's a complex kind of a situation where, first, just to recap, the shift from understanding a lockdown as a measure to control the disease to becoming a little more confident about disease control and then focusing full scale on economic recovery happened over 2020 once the September peak had abated. And nobody really saw the second wave coming, in the sense that there was no anticipation that the wave would be so much worse than the first peak. And so the understanding was that we probably did not gain that much from having a national level lockdown, and that there were many parts of the country then which could have continued to operate, thereby providing some sort of a balance economic situation. I mean, as in, some people in some parts of the country could have gone on working while other parts were. So there is a geography to the disease in the country. It's a large country. It's the densities are very varied across the board. And I think the move to this decentralized form is in response to that criticism that a national lockdown may not have been necessary the first time round.
So what is the situation on the ground as a result of the current method of multiple decentralized containment? I mean, did the mobility level go down? There's still some kind of a panic flight from cities, or actually mobility carries on, continue as usual?
So, I mean, if you map the last year in terms of mobility, there was this migrant exodus last summer. So that was somewhere between April, May, June of 2020. There is clear panic flight. And we know now that the panic flight was severely induced by the restriction in mobility itself. So the anxiety was that there is no public transport. I will not be able to get home. And so I'm going to resort to whatever means I need to adopt to move to a place where I consider is safer. To me, this is very parallel to sometimes refugee flight kind of movements, because there were people who were walking home really long distances with women and children in 45 degrees heat. This is not a rational kind of a thing to do. People were resorting to illegal transporters because district borders and state borders were sealed and controlled. So if you had to cross a jurisdictional border, you had to negotiate that with the police. And so they were resorting to operators who had the political connections to be able to do these. So it really became, again, like everything else, a bit of a political economy scenario where people were paying very high amounts of money that they could not afford to transporters who were negotiating these restrictions, these mobility restrictions, to get them home. Of course, this happened in the early parts, and then the state stepped in and enabled that mobility home. But that enabling came after 4 to 5 weeks of resistance from the state to facilitate that mobility. So the official line was, we need to keep workers wherever they are because we are in a lockdown. So we need to feed them, we need to give them cash assistance, we need to do whatever it takes so that they don't move back home, don't take the disease back home, and so that when we are out of the lockdown, the labor is available where it is required. So all of the imagination in April 2020 was that it will be done in 2 months, will be done in a few weeks. Nobody knew that, this was the trajectory of the disease would be so long. This year, there is no such restrictions. So there's no state borders sealed. The containments are very localized. Even when they are localized, there are exceptions for transport. So if you have a ticket, flight ticket, a train ticket, a bus ticket, you can take the three-wheeler or whatever, your tuk-tuk across the city to the bus stand. So these are not facilities that have come to a grinding standstill because of a national lockdown. Interstate buses are plying, trains are plying. They may not be as many as they were pre-COVID, but those options are available. And therefore, it hasn't been so much panic flight as sort of a measured and planned, relatively planned response, considering, sort of anticipating whether the province that we are in, or the state that we are in, or the city that we are in, looking at the case numbers, or just hearing from the rumor factories talking about how there are going to be the case numbers are rising, and so there's an impending lockdown, and these kind of rumors have fueled the movement. But we know from field, a sort of a little bit of dipstick research that we've been doing, that people did wait, for instance, for the March wages to come in before they left. So it wasn't like just leave because we don't even know whether we'll get paid. It was, let's take the wages, let's go back and let's wait it out, because if the lockdown comes, we don't want to go through what we went through last year. So there is a qualitative difference to how people have thought about their mobilities. The other point I wanted to bring is that through the year, it's been a very uncertain year for workers. So there's been mobilities through the year. It's not that there was mobility in the summer of 2020, and now there's mobility in the summer of 2021. Throughout the year, because a large part of India's migration is circular anyway, it has been circular for a very long time. And it's tied in with seasonal agrarian life cycles, it's tied in with how contractors manage work sites. And so those imperatives of where people moved wherever there was certain employment. And if there wasn't certain employment, they stayed in the villages because there were safety nets available there. So it was a very clear choice for people. I need to survive. I don't have employment available. I'm going to keep my family in the village. The main earning member may experiment with mobilities, move out, try out a few different things in order to get livelihoods in, but then retreat whenever those livelihoods were uncertain. So there were multiple movements through the year. And ironically, many people only came back by December 2020 or January 2021, when the first wave had completely subsided, when there was a, now we know, false sense of normalcy. That's when they came back, only to be hit with the second wave barely 2 months after they came back to the city. So that's really what's been happening on the ground.
Yeah, we really need to talk about the migrants a bit more. But before that, I think this comparison between the two waves of lockdown measures, the national lockdown or the regular minimum decentralized containment, is very interesting. At least two lessons can be drawn from here. Number one, as you mentioned, Indian appears to be, in my kind of a clumsy word, become a hostage of mobility. Is somehow the political economy cannot function almost without mobility. So this is what made the first lockdown in 2020 very costly, right? Because there's no alternative mechanisms to keep the livelihood going. And not only ordinary livelihood, but the entire system, as you mentioned, the political economy of election actually is economically very important for the whole system to keep going. So how should we understand the situation that modern society somehow become a hostage to mobility? I mean, we often celebrate mobility as a source of vibrancy and etc. That is true, but also whether or not there's a danger that the endless circulation itself became the essence of life rather than a means with which we want to achieve something. The second lesson, I suppose, is that in time of crisis, if we really need to stop mobility for a short time, what would be the best way of doing that? And we do see in some countries, lockdown did work. I mean, probably the China's case. I mean, in the beginning, the world was shocked. Oh, you lock down a city of 11 million people, Wuhan and etc. But it appeared to be, of course, there's a lots of the need to be revisited. Lots of issues needed to be revisited, but lockdown worked to some extent. So lots of empirical evidence needed to be collected in order to understand, in case we need to stop, and what would be the best way without negative consequences. Yeah. So thank you very much, Mukta.